How political should our research be? First, I'm going to apologize because PowerPoint etiquette is you shouldn't read off of slides, and I'm going to do an awful lot of that today because of the seriousness of the topic, and I really want you to hear the words of people who are rationalizing and justifying the fusion of politics, education, and politics and research. So, without further ado, what are we up to today? So I'm going to briefly outline a fundamental disagreement in Western thought and introduce a concept called metaphysical pathos. I'm then going to introduce Hegel and his dialectical project. I'm going to briefly touch on Marx and critical theories as practical continuations of Hegelian thought. I'm going to demonstrate what has been called the critical turn in the study of education and its practical political aims. I will then be introducing you to the curriculum transformation program that is currently taking place at the University of Edinburgh and present evidence for the influence of critical theory on this project. We'll then consider a couple of arguments for either side as to whether or we should politicize education and research. We'll then talk about Trofim Lysenko, a Soviet researcher, and the direct influence of Joseph Stalin on scientific outputs and the consequences of this intervention. We will then consider a handful of contemporary examples of the political influence on research, and I will finally conclude by suggesting that research and education should be minimally political. Sorry for the spoiler. So first of all, a fundamental disagreement in thought. Now I'm focusing on Western thought. This disagreement has probably happened throughout the world, but we're in a Western context, and this is a really nice painting. There are many people from 2,500 years ago all the way through to today who will be on either side and a mix of the two positions that I'm going to lay out to you now. So I'm just using Aristotle and Plato as sort of a paradigm example, not the only example. So on the left here we have Plato. His metaphysics, his idea of what was real and what was not. He was a dualist, and what this meant was that he believed that there were two realms of existence. So there were the realm of particulars, the realm of things, this table, this chair, me, this laptop, that screen, trees, the moon, sun, all of the things that you see from day to day. But he also believed there was a second realm of existence, and this was a universal realm. It was transcendent, it was immutable, never destroyed, never created, a perfect realm, and what occupied this realm was what he called the forms. Now you can think of this as thingness, and so the chairs, for example, trees, the sun, there was a universal perfect form of sunness, redness, greenness, humanness, flawness, and the particulars he believed partook in the forms that existed in this, you can see him pointing upwards, that existed in this universal and indestructible and never created realm. You can imagine kind of like a marionette, right? So the strings coming down from the piece of wood and the puppet partaking in the movement of the wood. It's a similar kind of idea. So you could have like the idea of redness or greenness or chairness or any other object. And all of the things, say like a cup, for example, any instance you saw of a cup was partaking in the form of cupness. Any chair you saw was partaking in the form of chairness. And his epistemology, his idea of where we got knowledge, was his idea of innate rationalism. That it was through using logos, reason, thinking about the forms, that we could come to true knowledge. The word philosophy is philia sophia, it is the love of wisdom. And the role of philosophy for Plato was you were to spend your entire life reasoning and thinking about this realm of the forms, and that when you died, your soul would depart from your mortal physical body, and it would transcend into the realm of the forms, and having practiced your entire life reasoning about them, and not just the things, right, but it was the form of goodness, the form of beauty, the form of piety, the love of God, the form of virtue. Aristotle, on the other hand, you can see him pointing downwards. Plato's like, it's up here, all the good things, they're up here. Plato's like, no, it's all down here. Right? He was a nominalist. He believed only the realm of particulars. There was no second realm, there was no up, there was no other place, it was just this place and this place only. His epistemology, his idea of how we came to knowledge was empiricism. We looked to this world of particulars to tell us about what was in it. We call this now the correspondence theory of truth, where if our concept aligns with an object, then bingo, you've landed on truth. And this disagreement was articulated very nicely and very simply by Herbert Fiegel in 1943, when he said, probably the most decisive division among philosophical attitudes is the one between worldly and otherworldly types of thought. So realm of the forms or particulars only. Profound differences in personality and temperament express themselves in the ever-changing forms these two kinds of outlook assume. Very likely there is here an irreconcilable divergence. So I just want to direct you to the point about differences in personality and temperament, that we are inclined for different parts of our life to be sort of emotively attached to claims about worldliness, otherworldliness, this worldliness, or broad claims about how our reality is organized. I then want to introduce Arthur O. Lovejoy and his concept of metaphysical pathos. And he defined this, he said, this is exemplified in any description of the nature of things, any characterization of the world to which one belongs, in terms which, like the words of a poem, awaken through their associations and through a sort of empathy which they engender a congenial mood or tone of feeling on the part of the philosopher or his readers. So what he's suggesting is that we have, while he didn't deny that we had these immensely powerful, logical, rational tools to think about claims, to think about philosophical arguments, but we also had this emotive, irrational aspect where we would be sympathetic to two broad claims about the nature of reality. He continues, he says, the susceptibility to different sorts of metaphysical pathos plays a great part both in the formation of philosophical systems by subtly guiding many a philosopher's logic and this is the important part, in partially causing the vogue and influence of different philosophies among groups or generations which they have affected. And I've given a couple of examples here. So like the claim that all is one. Those of you who may be inclined to holism, to holistic thinking, that the grand interconnected of all things and ultimately unifying them. Some of us have a sympathy to this. Some of us think it's ridiculous. The simplest answer is preferable. That's akin to Occam's razor. Some people think that's ridiculous. How could you say that the universe is so simple? It is an immense complexity. Reality is mind. Mind is nothing but matter. This world only and something more, those last two being Aristotle and Plato, broadly. So having introduced you to that concept, and we'll come back to it a little later, I want to talk to you about Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. So who was he? What was he up to? So he was born 1770, died 1831. He was a German idealist and a systems thinker. And it's really important to remember that he is a systems thinker, following people like Immanuel Kant, because his ultimate philosophical project was to put together a system of thought. And we'll say more about that in a moment. He was alive during the rise of modern science and definitely played a role in the thinking that happened around this during the rise of Enlightenment ideals of human progress, the egalitarian revolutions of the French and the Americans. Colonialism was happening at this time, as well as the creative, romantic, artistic era and philosophic era as well. So before we jump into Hegel, I just want to, I'm sorry for this diagram. I want to introduce you to Immanuel Kant's conception of how we experience reality. So in the bottom here, with the question mark, is the thing in itself. So this is the idea of objects that exist externally to us, independent of our mind and what we say about it. So regardless of what we say or think about what is happening, it is the way that it is and all the ways in which it is. This is the thing itself, or the Greek is the noumenon. We come into contact with this through our senses, and we conceptualize, having had the experience with the object in external reality, we conceptualize it in our minds, and then we construct and represent an appearance in our conscious experience. So right now I'm stood in front of you. Right? I am in the world externally to you. You are conceptualizing me in your mind and representing me in experience, in conscious experience, and I'm doing the same with yourselves. Now, Immanuel Kant said that we can't really say anything about the thing in itself, about the noumenon, or the Ding und sich, which I believe is the German, because all we ever have is the constructed appearance. There is an existential gap between us and that external reality, the thing in itself. And to demonstrate this a little bit, we can't even say that the thing in itself causes the conceptualization, because causation as a concept is a concept, and it's a disputed concept. David Hume, for example, said that all we ever see when we look at the world is causal events. If you take billiard balls on a pool table or a billiard table, all you see is one billiard ball move, make contact with another, and you see the second one move away. You never see the necessary connection between them. And if you look closer, all you will find is more causal events, one event and another event. If you look closer still, one event and another event. So even the idea of causation itself is a concept, and is one of the things that is up for question and in the space of represented and constructed experience. So for Kant, we couldn't say anything about the thing in itself. And so Hegel came along and he said, well, why do we have it then? If we can't say anything about it, just dispense with it. What's the point? I can't say anything about it. There's nothing we can do or theorize about it, so just dispense with it, and we'll just focus on the constructed appearance in thought, the phenomena, what is reality to us. So what was he up to? So as physicists are confronted by objects of experience in constant change and motion and interaction with one another, what they are after and what they seek are the universal and necessary truths about the world which explains this change. So for example, our laws of nature, empathy, entropy, laws of thermodynamics, relativity. Hegel, following Kant, in the diagram we've just saw that we could not say anything about the world as it was, as a mind-independent reality, and so he dispensed with the idea and focused his attention on the universal and necessary dynamics or laws of thought instead. For Hegel, this fundamental disagreement between the worldly and otherworldly thought, along with all other disagreements, revealed the existence of a unified body of knowledge, the universal and absolute idea, instead of a series of irreconcilable divergences, as Hegel suggested. Now, the reason why this revealed to him a universal body of knowledge was that each concept could be defined in its own terms. So if you take a pen, for example, you can define that particular pen as being that particular member of the group called pen, and it having the particular qualities that particular pen has. But that can also be defined in terms of what it is not. And I'll give you an example. We'll go back to the Platonic dualism. So what this is an acceptance of the realm of the forms and of the realm of the particulars. But at the same time, we can also define Platonic dualism in that it's not nominalism, which is an acceptance of the particulars only. So when we name something, it excludes it from being everything else. When we draw a concept and we define something, we define it in terms not only of being what it is, but by the fact that it is not literally everything else, because it is that one thing. Like this one chair here is this chair, and it is not every single thing else. Any conceivable object or concept, it is not that, it is this chair. So implicit in the idea of one thing is the negated idea of everything else. So having defined what it is and what it is not, this leaves us with a contradiction, because we've made explicit in the definition of one object both chair and not chair. And that violates the law of contradiction, P and not P at the same place at the same time in thought. I'll stress to remember that this is Hegel was concerned with thought and not actually having chair and not chair in the same place at the same time. So having arrived at a contradiction, we can know that we haven't reached the absolute. Because if our concept encompassed thought itself, there would be no thing to contradict it. It would be a unified body of thought, and so nothing would be outside of it. And so by the fact that we can think of something, and we can think of the fact that it's not something else, that gives rise to a contradiction. This tells us we haven't arrived at the absolute. And so what we need to do is we need to step back, and we need to see this contradiction as part of the dynamic of thought itself, as part of a larger unified whole, and arrive at a more inclusive and unified concept, which will either be free from contradiction, which will tell us we've arrived at the absolute ideal, or will itself need to be investigated to continue the process towards the absolute. And here's what Hegel has to say about this. The goal is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where concept corresponds to object and object to concept. An object in this instance is thought itself. Hence, the progress towards this goal is unhalting, and short of it, no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations along the way. And so I've put together a couple of diagrams to try and help visualize this. So if we start with the one on the left, we take the idea of a whole apple. Let's call it a Granny Smith apple. And we can define this apple in terms of what it is. It's an apple, it has a bruise on it, it has this color around it, it has the texture and feel to it. But we can also, if we think about it, we can also define this apple as not another Granny Smith apple. And we can think of this other Granny Smith apple as also not being this first apple. And we can make that explicit in the idea of both of these apples. And so in the idea of both of these apples, we have the idea of this apple and not this apple, and this apple and not this apple. So we've arrived at a contradiction. So what we need to do is we need to step back, see things as part of a larger whole, and Hegel's language for this was that you start with the abstract, so apple. You then negate the abstract, so not this apple, some other apple. And then you think really, really hard, and you arrive at a more concrete, more unified concept. And at this point, it is the whole type of apple that we're talking about, so Granny Smith apple. Now, the German for this process, which in English we use the word sublation, but it's aufheben. Now, that word means to keep, to destroy, and to transcend at precisely the same time. So what we do when we have this contradiction is we dispense with the particulars of this apple and this apple. We keep the essence of what they are, and we transcend the concept, so we resolve the contradiction, so we're no longer left with one. And we arrive at a more concrete, unified concept, more inclusive concept, such as this whole type of apple that is Granny Smith apple. Well, have we arrived at the absolute? Well, let's think about it. What's a jazz apple, right? Or a Ray-Ban, or a pink lady apple, or a midget apple, or any other kind of apple, right? Well, the whole type of Granny Smith apple is not any of these other kinds of apples. And so implicit in the idea of Granny Smith apple is not a jazz apple, and implicit in the idea of jazz apple is not a Granny Smith apple. And you can make that explicit in the idea of both, giving rise to the contradiction. And you step back and you see them as part of a larger whole, and you land in a more unified concept, more concrete concept, having dispensed with the particulars, maintain the essence, and we land on the whole category of apple. Well, apples are not oranges, and oranges are not apples. But we can make explicit the idea of each other, giving rise to a contradiction. We step back, see them as part of a larger whole, dispense with the particulars, keep the essence, and land in a more concrete, unified concept of fruit. Well, fruit is not a shrubbery, and shrubbery is not a fruit. Right? A pretty one at that as well, for any Python fans. And so we do the same thing again and again. We land on the whole category of fruit. We sublate, transcend to the whole category of plants. Plants aren't dogs and dogs aren't plants. Both is implicit in the idea of the other. Step back, see them as part of a larger whole. We have the whole category of living things, and so on and so on. Now, I like this diagram because we can see the logic of Hegel's thought here. Because if we start with the whole apple, which is the idea of the sort of the least inclusive idea, and we can see as we step up, the idea becomes more and more inclusive. That it follows, if we continue this process, from the least inclusive to more inclusive, we will arrive at some point at the most inclusive idea. The idea that encapsulates the dynamic of thought itself and everything that is contained within it. So these other two diagrams, same dynamics, represented slightly differently. So bottom right, we have, so the abstract, we start with one, we negate it to another. They're both defined in terms of each other and in terms of what they're not. So we transcend them and we wind up with a couple. A couple is the abstract, we then negate some others over here, we combine them together, transcend the idea of a few, and we do the same thing again, a few, many others, and we wind up with the concept of all. And this diagram at the top right, this is what that would look like if you stood above those triangles and you looked down, right? So in the circle on the left, you could say, take the idea of one, and then the circle on the right is so the circle on the left is the abstract. The circle on the right is the negation, right? So another, and the arrows represent that both is implied. Sorry, the opposite is implied in either, and that the oval circle that surrounds them represents the more unified concrete concept, having stepped back, seen them as part of a larger whole, and arrived at a more concrete concept. And then when you arrive at that concrete concept, that then becomes the abstract, circle on the left. So a couple, which was the oval, then becomes the circle on the left. The circle on the right becomes some others. Step back, see them as part of a larger whole. That becomes a few. The circle on the left becomes a few. Many others on the right, and so on and so on and so forth. And this kind of just keeps happening. So I do hope that makes a little more sense visually. And I know it's not. Hegel is notoriously difficult to understand. Oh, you didn't get that? Okay, nice. No, I thought you were with me. I wasn't, to be fair. So we're done with Hegel for the time being. So briefly, I know, right? You and me both. So Marx and critical theories. Marx's dialectical materialism, out of the ideal and into practical politics. I want to say something quickly about back to Hegel. I'm sorry. I have no problem personally with Hegel's philosophical project. This is not. Don't mistake this as me slagging his philosophical project off, because it's a ballsy endeavor, right? Just to try and encompass an entire system of thought. However you feel about it, it is philosophically fascinating. My problem begins with Marx, and we'll hear what he has to say about it. My dialectic method is not only different from Hegel's, but it's direct opposite, which is quite Hegelian, actually. For Hegel, the thought process, which he transforms in an independent subject, even under the name of idea, is the demiurge of the real. Now, demiurge is the Greek for artisan or creator. And if we remember back to the image representing Kant's vision of reality, or how we interacted with reality, so we conceptualize our interaction with a thing in itself, and then we represent it in what seems like external consciousness. And that's what Marx is referring to there. So the thought process, which he transforms in an independent subject, even under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real, which only forms its outer appearance, as everything is appearing externally to you now. With me, conversely, the ideal is nothing other than the material transposed and translated in the human head. So Marx was way more material with this, obviously. His idea was that there's the object, bang, idea, and that's the end of it. There's no more. It's not more complicated than that. It is not the consciousness of people that determines their being, but conversely, their social being, their material existence, that determines their consciousness. For Marx, Hegel's is a false picture of reality, and it neglects the concrete, material, historical conditions that shape and determine human outcomes. And he famously said, "Philosophers hitherto have sought to interpret the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Marx puts the dialectic to work in practical politics in bringing about change in the world. So following the failure of Marx's economic analysis to bring socialism to the West, 20th century neo-Marxists reoriented their energies towards a cultural and structural focus. This saw the rise of the Frankfurt School, the Institute of Social Research, in other words, the narrow definition of critical theory, capitalized C, capitalized T. So the next couple of quotes are from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on critical theory. If you're interested, check it out. It's a good read. According to these theorists, a critical theory may be distinguished from a traditional theory according to a specific practical purpose. A theory is critical to the extent that it seeks human emancipation from slavery, acts as a liberating influence, and works to create a world which satisfies the need and powers of human beings. That's a quote from Horkheimer, one of the OG critical theorists. It follows from Horkheimer's definition that a critical theory is adequate, so good, only if it meets three criteria. It must be explanatory, practical, and normative, all at the same time. That is, it must explain what is wrong with current social reality, identify the actors to change it, and provide both clear norms for criticism and achievable practical goals for social transformation. So I just want to focus on the explanatory, practical, and normative bit for a moment. The explanatory and the normative, to give an explanation or description of reality, and to make normative claims, which is to say how things ought to be. Right? So if I were to say, in an American context, you shouldn't own guns. Right? You should own guns. Women shouldn't have abortions. Women should have abortions. These are all normative claims saying how things ought to be. And as far as those elements of critical theory are concerned, I have zero problems whatsoever, because they are abstract, philosophical aspects of their work. And while I am a strong proponent of academic freedom, and even if I disagree with their analysis of how things are and their description of how things ought to be, which is usually just pointing at things and saying not that, they're allowed to do that as far as I'm concerned. The point and the problem I have is the practical aspect, and all of this happening at the same time. See, normally in traditional theory, we engage in theorizing, we come up with hypotheses, and then we slowly and carefully test, experiment on the concrete reality. And when we get to the point of implementation, again, we do it very, very tentatively. Wow, that's hard to say. And so we start off with a small group, and then we get bigger and bigger and bigger. But for critical theorists, this is insufficient if you're seeking to bring about radical cultural change, if you're seeking to change the world, and you're seeking human emancipation from slavery, as they describe our society. Then it is not good enough to have this gap between theory and practice. And as we're about to see, they are going to combine these things. Critical theorists have long sought to distinguish their aims, methods, theories, and forms of explanation from standard understandings in both the natural and the social sciences. Just to clarify what that means, is that they've long sought to distinguish their aims, methods, theories, and forms of explanation from the liberal scientific enterprise, or the scientific method, as you may refer to it. Instead, they have claimed that social inquiry ought to combine rather than separate, how Hegelian, the poles of philosophy and the social sciences: explanation and understanding, structure and agency, and regularity and normativity. Such an approach, critical theorists argue, permits their enterprise to be practical in a distinctively moral rather than instrumental sense. So I'd like to focus on the combining of structure and agency and the combining of regularity and normativity. You may be familiar with the idea that it is not good enough to just simply not be racist, to take a neutral stance, to claim neutrality. You have to be actively anti-racist. Well, this is an example of the combining of structure and agency. Right? It is not good enough for you simply to just not be a racist person, which, if you were thinking about people as individuals, as having that individual agency, generally I think people would say that that would be a sufficient achievement to not be a racist. But if you are not actively pushing back against the oppressive racist structures, then you are a racist, even if you would consider yourselves not a racist. If you fail to push back against the structures of racism, then you are a racist, and you're complicit in the perpetuation of that structure. So that's just a quick example of what happens when you combine structure and agency. Regularity and normativity, well, let's think about what they mean for a second. Regularity. Well, our laws of nature that we were talking about earlier, they are regularities. They're so regular we consider them laws. There has not been a single instance where we've observed reality and we've been proven wrong about what we consider to be laws of nature, and that's why they're laws of nature. Even this laptop is regularly occurring on top of this box in front of me right now. Normativity, we covered that earlier. It's making claims about how things ought to be. Well, what does it mean to combine regularity and normativity? What does it mean to take how things are and how things ought to be and smush them together? Well, you make how things ought to be into how they are. If I had an object in my hand that isn't valuable and will break when I throw it, I could say that it offends me that it is in the position in which it is regularly occurring and it ought to be somewhere else. or to combine regularity and normativity. If I lobbed it somewhere else, I would have done so. I would have achieved combining regularity and normativity by making how I think things ought to be into how they are, which is very much the project of critical theorists, as we've heard. So just to back up a little bit, the idea of the distinction that they draw between the traditional methodological approach to research and a critical theorist's approach to research. I want to read you a quick quote from the introduction of this book, Power and Method, Political Activism and Educational Research. But don't judge a book by its cover. This is from a series of books called the Critical Social Thought series, and it's edited by a person called Michael W. Apple. Remember that name, he's going to come up again in a little while. Quote, for those writing in this volume, the central question is not how researchers of different orientations can learn to get along so that we can maintain the discipline and continue doing research in accustomed ways, but how the whole enterprise of research, both qualitative and quantitative, can be reconceptualized so that it can more powerfully act on some of the most persistent and important problems of our schools, namely those surrounding issues of race, class, and gender. So just to re-emphasize that, the central question in this book is how the whole enterprise of research can be reconceptualized so that it can more powerfully act on some of the most persistent and important problems of our schools, namely those surrounding issues of race, class, and gender. So this is the explicit fusion of politics and research from the outset of this book. So this is another book from the same series. This is a book called The Critical Turn in Education, subtitle From Marxist Critique to Post-Structuralist Feminism to Critical Theories of Race. I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs from the introduction. Oh, this is by Isaac Gottsman, published in 2016. To the question, where did all the 60s radicals go? The most accurate answer would be neither to religious cults nor yuppiedom, but to the classroom. After the fall of the New Left, capital N, capital L, arose a new left, an academic left. For many of these young scholars, Marxist thought, and particularly what some refer to as Western Marxism or neo-Marxism, and what Isaac Gottsman, will refer to as the critical Marxist tradition, this was an intellectual anchor. As participants in the radical politics of the 60s entered graduate school and moved into faculty positions and started publishing, the critical turn began to change scholarship throughout the humanities and the social sciences. The field of education was no exception. The turn to critical Marxist thought is a defining moment in the last 40 years of educational scholarship, especially for the educational scholars who identify as part of the political left. It introduced the ideas and vocabulary that continue to frame most conversations in the field about social justice, such as hegemony, ideology, consciousness, praxis, and most importantly, the word critical itself, which has become ubiquitous as a descriptor for left educational scholarship. Initially sequestered in curriculum studies and sociology of education, today, critical scholarship, critical Marxian scholarship, is frequently published in the journals of some of the field's most historically conservative areas, such as educational administration and science education. The critical turn radicalized the field. He continues on the next page. The critical turn has contributed greatly to educational scholarship. This is something to celebrate. Later on, he identifies himself as part of the we. He says, my intention is simply to push, and in doing so, contribute to a conversation that will help critical scholars engage in more strategic political advocacy. It is no exaggeration to say the world is on fire. We must ask ourselves if we are moving forward with the thoughtfulness and analytical care that radical social change requires, and if our inquiry and our advocacy, our scholarly publishing and our on-the-ground activism is helping us realize, to make real, the world of our radical imaginations. So I think that's pretty clear what they're up to. You make up your own minds, though. Don't let me tell you what to think. Oh, no, hang on, I'm not done. So Michael W. Apple, serious editor of this book, has this to say at the beginning, just to add on to that last quote. The critical turn in education has been integrated into the formal corpus of official programs in education throughout the world. I am certain that this was not an easy thing to do, and it constitutes a victory. So on that note, the University of Edinburgh and the Curriculum Transformation Program. What is it? So this is a university-wide reconceptualization of how the curriculum and teaching is thought of and delivered at the University of Edinburgh. This is due to be implemented, ready for the 2026-27 cohort of students. It's been pushed back a year, thankfully. Hopefully they keep doing that. Once fully implemented, this will impact in any 1 year over 40,000 students, although I think it's closer to 45,000 now. So this is no trivial change. We can see that the scope of the transformation is UG, undergraduate, PGT, which is postgraduate, and elements of the, I think that's postgraduate research experience. And it's also concerned with the structures of the university, the principles, and the infrastructure. And one of the central approaches that we're going to focus on a little later is the idea of co-creation, so students and faculty contributing to the creation of the curriculum, which maybe sounds like an innocuous idea. So if you go onto the University of Edinburgh's website and you find the Teaching Matters page, in which you will find a tab for the Curriculum Transformation Program. If you click on it, 3 tabs will come up. There'll be a couple of videos from Peter Matheson and Colm Harmon talking about why this is a really good idea. There will then be an overview similar to what we've just seen on the screen before. And then there is a third tab that's called Insights and Evidence. If you click on this tab, it then presents about 11 PDF files. If you click on the first one, this is what comes up. Curriculum Conceptualizations and the University of Edinburgh, published by Dr. Catherine Boville, who works for the Institute for Academic Development at the University of Edinburgh in March of 2021. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'm going to go through some aspects of this briefing paper. I'm just going to read some excerpts, and we'll check out the sources as well. So there is substantial critique of rational linear models of curriculum focused wholly on content and structure. Fine. Referencing Grundy, 1987. Well, let's check the reference. Grundy, S, 1987, curriculum, product, or praxis. Remember that word that came up a second ago that the critical theorists have introduced into conversations around social justice. Well, let's have a look at curriculum, product, or praxis. Page 1. There have been, of course, other more radical curriculum theorists who have proposed other theoretical foundations for the construction of curricula. I have found the work of Michael Apple and Henry Giroux of particular worth in this respect. That work shows that a Marxist critique can bring into question many of the assumptions of benign interest which we make of our education system and our school curricula. Back to the briefing paper. And many researchers have proposed understanding the curriculum as a process, kind of like how Hegel thought of his process of developing thought, referencing William Pinar, or Pinar 1975. Arguments for process-based definitions are often based on recognizing the Latin root of curriculum, meaning a race, and its derivative, curre, I think, as meaning to run the race or the curriculum process, again referencing Pinar. Well, let's check out the citation. William Pinar, 1975, Career Towards Reconceptualization, in a book edited by William Pinar called Curriculum Theorizing, the Reconceptualists. Well, let's go back to Isaac Gottsman's The Critical Turn in Education. In 1975, Scientific Interests and the Hidden Curriculum, papers written by Michael W. Apple, were reprinted in Curriculum Theorizing, the Reconceptualists, edited by William Pinar. The collection was intended to name a turn in curriculum theory away from the atheoretical standpoint of traditionalists and toward work steeped in the theory and practice of present-day social science. Though Apple never aligned himself with the term or identified with the Reconceptualist movement, by Pinar's standard, because of Apple's non-traditional work in curriculum field, he was a Reconceptualist. In fact, Pinar wrote, if I were asked to name one of the 2 or 3 most important critics at work in the curriculum field today, I would answer Michael W. Apple. A range of curriculum conceptualizations are contained in this paper, but one possible guiding definition informed by the literature is an active and emergent process involving student and staff interaction and negotiation of the whole experience of learning. This includes teaching practices, assessment, values. Whose values? I don't know the answer to these questions. Ethics, ways of being and becoming. Oh, I forgot to mention this actually. One of the paradigm examples, back to Hegel, I'm sorry. One of the paradigm examples of Hegel's abstract negation and concrete is the idea of being, negated by the idea of nothing and sublated or synthesized to the idea of becoming. So is this an allusion to Hegel? I don't know. Maybe. Ways of knowing. Well, this could be innocent, but it could also, if we go back to Gottsman's The Critical Turn in Education, it could be an allusion to feminist standpoint epistemology. So this is a chapter titled Situated Knowledge and Feminist Standpoint Epistemology. I'm just grabbing a quote from the middle of a paragraph, so it's a little out of context, but it makes the point. The question was about the ways teachers and researchers acknowledge and develop an understanding, a consciousness, a critical consciousness maybe, of their own subjectivity, of their own standpoint, and enables them to see how their position in webs of power has direct implications for coming to know. So this is the idea that the particular standpoint that you have and the consciousness that you have in thinking about your position in webs and dynamics of power has an impact on your way of knowing. Again, these are questions. None of this is an aha moment. I'm just pointing to the several weird things that I found in the very first document that I looked at on the website, on the University of Edinburgh's website, under their Insights and Evidence page, the first document. And taking a critical stance on and contributing to the global and local world around us. Well, which definition of critical are we using here? Because if we go back to Isaac Gottsman, he tells us that it has become ubiquitous as a descriptor for left educational scholarship within the context of critical neo-Marxism. Or is it critical as a sense of urgency? Like it's critical, a critical stance on and contributing to the global and world around us. Or is it the more traditional critical thinking? You know, looking at a text, breaking it apart, drawing inference, thinking about the meanings of words in relation to other words, kind of like the thing that we're doing right now. Is it that kind of critical thinking? Which one is it? I don't know. This one's funny. The university needs to be clear about the purpose of any curriculum transformation and to communicate this purpose clearly and consistently. I agree. It does need to do that. It does need to do that. I'm waiting, though, still. Oh, I will say, I wrote a paper about this last summer because I stumbled across this by accident at the back end of last summer, and I wrote, it was a fairly long one to be fair, but I summarized everything up at the beginning, and I sent it to Kathy Boville, I sent it to John Turner, who heads up the program, I sent it to Colm Harmon, the vice principal, I sent it to Peter Matheson, the vice principal, I sent it to the rector, and I sent it to a few other people who were involved in the conversation as well. I had a very short conversation with Kathy Boville where she reassured me that critical theory had nothing to do with the curriculum transformation program. And I had and I did meet with John. I had a good conversation with him. He also reassured me that critical theory had nothing to do with the curriculum transformation program, but he did seem amenable to the idea that there might be, that in the academic context that we're in, that there might be radical political activists seeking to use the infrastructure of education to bring about radical cultural change. And he said he'd keep an eye out for it. It goes on to say, because it's talking about values at this point, these values are likely to connect to existing strategic priorities that might include, for example, a curriculum that uses evidence-based teaching. Well, is this evidence-based teaching that has arisen out of the kind of research that has been fused with political activism? Don't know. Has research experience embedded throughout? Same question. What kind of research are we talking about here? I don't know the answer to this question. Is inclusive and celebrates diversity? Well, again, we come to a question of definition. What do you mean by inclusive? Do you mean don't exclude people because of things they can't help? Or do you mean so it is not good enough to just include someone, they have to feel included, and if they don't feel included, you have to exclude that which makes them feel not included? Because then inclusion means exclusion, doesn't it? So if that's what you mean by inclusion and you're going to celebrate that, then that's a different story. What about diversity? Having a whole or a different array of viewpoints, people from different backgrounds. Fantastic, not a problem. It's what universities and academia is for. It's the whole bloody point. Or do you mean a whole bunch of different people who all think the same in terms of having critical Marxian consciousness, depending on the particular context that they're dealing with, whether it's critical race consciousness, critical queer consciousness, post-structuralist feminist consciousness, critical fact consciousness, which I don't know. Again, I don't know. Some more ones down here, ways of knowing, we've spoken about that. Developing critical thinking, again, I've got no idea what they're talking about when they say critical thinking. Ways of being and becoming, perhaps another allusion to Hegel. Drawing upon students' previous and current experience to ensure relevance and foster student engagement. This one, I think, is... Paulo Freire, a neo-Marxist educator and theologian from the 1960s and 70s, he had this idea of generative themes, where you would get the learner, as he called it, to focus on their concrete political crisis. There was a study done in West Africa where Paulo Freire's education theory was applied or tested, or an experiment was run, where the first stage was a dialogical process where the teachers would just talk to them about their concrete political existence, the struggles that they had, poverty, perhaps hunger, and not nice things. The second stage was that after the conversation, certain themes, and what he called generative themes, were abstracted and then used in the education. So words like slums, poverty, hunger, death were sort of used as a pedagogical, as a teaching mechanism. And then the third stage, where they were supposed to learn to read because it was a literary program, well, that didn't happen because everyone was enraged and then in a state of an emotional distress because they'd been wound up by the people who were running their educational program. And no teaching happened, none. They even turned on the teacher in anger, saying, well, why aren't you doing something about the thing you've been making me think about for the last 2 or 3 weeks? But that's a little tenuous. Maybe it's unreasonable of me to draw that connection. So co-creation, staff and student co-creation. So it can be helpful to distinguish between co-creation of the curriculum and co-creation in the curriculum. Co-creation of the curriculum involves co-design of a macro-level institutional curriculum or a program or course, usually before the curriculum, program, or course takes place, and often involving a selected group of students. So this is the idea, kind of like what they do at the moment, where they survey people after a course, or they just get some students in to sort of do a workshop and get some feedback, and then they take the feedback, they abstract some possible lessons, and then they, again, tentatively apply it to the curriculum. It's a slow process, or it's not immediate, doesn't happen right now. And co-creation in the curriculum involves co-design of learning and teaching within a curriculum, program, or course as it takes place, and often involving all students in the class or cohort, so that the curriculum becomes this dynamic, evolving process. I want to be very clear, I'm not poo-pooing this idea straight out of the bat, because there is probably a way in which that actually might be quite exciting or pedagogically useful as sort of an open, dynamic classroom. I'm just really pointing to the context in terms of, because I'm not a specialist in education, far from it. So there's a lot of this where I'm also not opposed to radical different approaches to education either. I'll tell you a couple of stories quickly. So I read a really interesting book a couple of years ago called Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. He was a slave just as slavery ended. He was a boy and a slave just as slavery ended in America. And he grew up to be an educator, and he was provided with the opportunity to run a university for blacks in America, to provide them with an education. Now, the money was tight, and the opportunity that he was given was a big plot of land, 30 students, and a small a pig pen. And that was it. And they had to build a school with the students. They had to build a school. It's still standing now. It's the University of Tuskegee in Alabama. I think 60% of the university, as it currently stands, was built by the students. And his philosophy of education involved, because his approach to race relations in America at the time was, well, no one's coming to save us, and we shouldn't rely on anybody, and we have a community to build and a community and people to raise out of the dirt. And so if you come to this school, it needs to be kept up. It needs to be built. It needs to be cleaned. We need bedding, we need furniture, we need food. And so his educational philosophy included, so in the morning and in the evenings you would do book learning, but during the day you would pick, it was your choice. You could pick or roll something to do, making bricks in the kiln, making furniture, growing food, tilling the fields. And he built this into his educational program. And it was so successful that it even broke down some of the barriers with the sort of whites in the South. Because the products that they were producing, the food they were growing, the beds they were making, because they were combining this with book learning and training and discipline, what they were producing very, very high standard products. And they were then selling them to the people around them. And this didn't take. He ended up giving some speeches in Atlanta, and I think he met the president. And there was quite a big wave behind this idea of education being like applied across the board because it seemed to be so effective. But for some reason, it didn't stick. The other story is the Evergreen University in America. You may have heard of it. There was a collapse at the university in 2017, 2018, I think. But they had a particularly radical approach to education. It was basically, if you were an educator, you do what you want. Right? There is no stricture on you. You can organize your course as you wish. It was very liberal, very left-wing, not in the radical sense, but just in the classical liberal sense in America. And again, this was for the students that didn't fit into the standard curriculum model that universities around America were offering. It was perfect. It was ideal. It was very outdoorsy. There were a lot of field trips. You would go away. Your education would be built into the practices that you would engage in while you're out exploring the world. They would go to places like Ecuador. They would go to South America, stay away. They had, the courses were not 11 weeks. It was whole years. My point is, I'm rambling. My point is, I'm not closed off to radically different approaches to education. I just want to stress that in case this gets misunderstood as me saying, oh, don't change things, I like it, because that's not what I'm saying. So, Kathy Boville, and I'm sorry to have to do this with the face and the name and everything, but I have tried to talk to these people. I wrote a paper, I tried to speak to them, they won't talk to me. I invited her onto my podcast to come and have this conversation, and yeah, I haven't gotten very far. So here we are. So her role, this is from the University of Edinburgh website, staff profiles. I lead a team in the Institute of Academic Development to support program and course design across the university. I have multiple roles within the large-scale university curriculum transformation program, member of the support group for the Curriculum Transformation Board, co-chair of the Curriculum Transformation Student Engagement Strategy Group, and member of the Curriculum Design Principles and Architecture Workstream. So she's not uninfluential in the program. She's also a teaching fellow, and this is why they give them to you. This is from their website, Advanced HE. The National Teaching Fellowship Scheme recognizes, rewards, and celebrates individuals who have made an outstanding impact on student outcomes and the teaching profession. So this is not an uninfluential lady in her profession. And this is a paper she wrote on co-creation of curriculum in 2013. Students and staff co-creating curricula, a new trend or an old idea we never got around to implementing. However, discussion about co-creation of curricula has been most strongly evident in schools-based literature, with many important discussions framed within student voice and critical pedagogy. And, sorry, 2 seconds. There we go. This is that same paper. And she's talking about the history of the concept of co-creation, where she says, the 1960s also saw rising dissatisfaction with many other state policies, this is in the US, most starkly demonstrated by university student riots around the world. In the USA, protests were a culmination of the growth of the civil rights movement and the free speech movement, as well as the results of protest against Vietnam. She does leave out that Herbert Marcuse, the most influential critical theorist in the 20th century, was very much influential on these movements. She says the 1970s saw continuing critique of formal schooling. Illich, in his book Deschooling Society, provided a damning indictment of the problems with the formal schooling system. Similarly, Jürgen Habermas, another critical theorist, his work critiqued the legitimacy of the interest and values of formal education systems, and his work was highly influential for writers such as Henry Giroux, Michael Appel, and others who developed the idea of critical pedagogy over the following decades. Perhaps one of the most well-known publications in the 1970s was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This book is the third most cited work in the humanities and social sciences, or at least in the education part. It's got something like 72,000 citations. It is a tremendously influential book. She references William Pennard. She talks about Henry Giroux, Michael Appel, bell hooks. She says, critical pedagogy literature was focused mainly upon education in the school setting. However, it still offers valuable and relevant insights for those in higher education concerned to democratize learning within the academy. Indeed, this literature informs many of the calls for co-created curricula and student-faculty partnerships in learning and teaching. Drawing on the work of Foucault, power, which is frequently viewed as a relationship between the dominator and the oppressed, can instead be seen in a new light as a result of critical inquiry into the power relationships. Critical pedagogy can help the oppressed to realize that they have power to resist domination and can alter existing power relationships. She goes on to say that the current higher education literature calling for students to be more active participates... Oh, hang on a second, I misread that. However, this current higher education literature calling for students to be more active participants in their learning does not always draw upon the long tradition of critical pedagogy, but it does sometimes, presumably, or popular education and the more radical emancipatory or transformatory rationales that underpin calls for negotiated curricula in much of the historical literature. So again, I'm asking a question here. Having had a conversation with this woman who told me that critical theory had next to nothing to do with the curriculum transformation program, if we go back to the scope and the approach of the curriculum transformation program, one of the central approaches was co-creation of the curricula, a topic that Kathy Bovell has herself been writing about at least for the last 10 years, and in her own work gives a historical account of the influence that critical theory has had on the concept of co-creation in the curriculum. So again, big question mark. If we go to the back of the briefing paper, we bump into the concept of hidden curriculum, which usually refers to the norms, values, and beliefs transmitted, often unintentionally during teaching, which are not referred to within the formal curriculum, but which can impact significantly on the learning experience. Again, if we return to Gottsman's The Critical Turn in Education, in 1971, Appel published The Hidden Curriculum and the Nature of Conflict. The article was Appel's first scholarly work grounded in the Marxist tradition. Coined by Philip Jackson in his 1968 book, the term hidden curriculum was meant to describe the ways in which behavior is normalized through school and classroom structures and practices. Appel extended Jackson's definition to include the ideas normalized in the curriculum itself. Now, this definition at the top seems to align more with Appel's conceptualization. However, whether or not it's Appel's or Philip Jackson's, there's no citation been offered with this very influential concept in curriculum theorizing. And it's a glossary. I don't know if you're supposed to cite in glossaries. I don't know if that's a rule or not. Again, not sure. So this is a curriculum transformation undergraduate framework overview from earlier on this year. John was polite enough to send this to me on my request. This was published by John Turner and Colm Harmon. Again, Turner is the transformation project lead, and Colm Harmon is the vice principal and project sponsor. I want to focus mostly on the top one, the responding to the climate emergency and sustainable development goals. Now, I came across this document. It's Knowledge-Driven Actions Transforming Higher Education for Global Sustainability. And on the first page, it says the 2030 agenda must be embraced by higher education institutions. And this is from UNESCO, the United Nations. Now, the curriculum transformation program, I did forget to say, is within the University of Edinburgh's Strategy 2030. And when I found this document, I thought, I wonder if those two things have any relation to one another. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. So I emailed John, I sent him this document, and I said, John, does the curriculum transformation have anything to do with this call that the United Nations have put out for higher educations to embrace the 2030 Agenda 2030, sorry, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and he said, no, it wasn't. He said, a lot of large institutions are probably looking forward into the future 10 years and putting together plans and strategies. Just a coincidence. However, the Curriculum Transformation Program within Strategy 2030, I didn't highlight this bit, but it's the first sentence under 49, says curriculum transformation will support a positive contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The SDGs are the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Transforming the World. If you type in Agenda 2030 into Google, the first website that comes up is the United Nations, sdgs.org. I'll be honest, I feel like I'm being lied to. Just a little bit. Just a little bit. And I'm not happy to say that, by the way, because the interaction I had with John Turner when I met up and I had coffee with him, he seems like a lovely guy. And I don't want to slander him at all, but I'm having a difficult time figuring out how to respond with the information that I'm being presented with and the information that I'm coming across. We've already spoken about how the terms like diversity, inclusion, how there is a way of interpreting these words from within the tradition of critical theory. James Lindsay's done a really good job with his translations from the Wokish of giving an account of terms used and the sort of using their literature to give, so for the inclusion and diversity example I gave, so using their literature to explain that definition of inclusion meaning exclusion and diversity meaning a group of people who all think the same. So that's, you can go and check that out, and that's pretty interesting. But again, when I asked Kathy Boville and John Turner, does critical theory play any role or any influential role in the curriculum transformation program, and they say no, a particularly focus, it's an educational document, so that's good. A particular focus will be on opportunities to embed EDI in course and program design. So these terms that are very much up for question in terms of what they mean and where their sources come from. And there's a very, very strong argument to be made given the other presence of critical theory that we have found in this, well, sorry, this is not in the briefing paper, in just the first 2 pages that we looked at. And again, this is published by John Turner. So I'm jumping back and forward here, but again, I'm having a hard time figuring out how to feel about this and how to think about it. Because how can you say that, no, the critical theory doesn't have anything to do with the curriculum transformation program, but we're going to be embedding EDI in course and program design? Anywho, moving on from the curriculum transformation program, arguments for the politicization of research and education. And this is from Sandra Harding, The Science, Question, and Feminism in Andrew Gitlin's Power and Method. Well, she says, feminist politics is not just a tolerable companion of feminist research, but a necessary condition for generating, that's supposed to say less, partial and perverse descriptions and explanations. In a socially stratified society, get this, the objectivity of the results of research is increased by political activism by and on behalf of oppressed, exploited, and dominated groups. So, by fusing politics, which is a desire to have society organized a particular way, and activism, which is the practice of seeking to bring that about, which I think it's fair to say that's a significant bias, fusing this with research makes it more objective. Only through such struggles can we begin to see beneath the appearances created by an unjust social order and to the reality of how this social order is in fact constructed and maintained. And again, that's kind of a hint to that Kantian Hegelian idea of the society itself is constructed by the concepts that we use to think about it. Maybe. Henry Giroux, arguing for the fusion of politics and education in this case. Critical theory's engagement with modernity and democracy must be rethought and formulated, but only if taken up through the postmodern assertion that democracy is never finished and must be viewed primarily as a process of democratization. The search for a new politics and a new critical language must invigorate the relationship between democracy, ethics, and political agency by expanding the meaning of the pedagogical as a political practice while at the same time making the political more pedagogical. That's supposed to say pedagogy there. Pedagogy is a moral and political practice that is always implicated in power relations and must be understood as a cultural politics that offers both a particular version and vision of civic life, the future, and how we might construct representations of ourselves, others, and our physical and social environment. Making the political more pedagogical in this instance suggests producing modes of knowledge and social practices that not only affirm opposition or cultural work, so seeking to bring about a desired state of political affairs, but offer opportunities to mobilize instances of collective outrage, if not collective action. And Paulo Freire sums both of these viewpoints up quite nicely by saying education which fails to recognize the highly educational role of righteous anger that protests against injustice, against indifference, against exploitation and violence is wrong. So if your education is not explicitly political and oriented towards the critical Marxian goals, it is wrong. Arguments against the politicization of research. This is from Daphne Pate. This is also from Andrew Gitlin's Power and Method. There are a couple of essays in there that are critiquing the idea of fusing politics and research. So at least they're in there. Acknowledging the fact that politics, in a general way, always influences education and intellectual work is a far cry from celebrating that influence and intentionally cultivating it. To refuse to draw a distinction here is like saying, as we can never be sure that we are being entirely truthful, we might as well lie all the time. So that's akin to saying, education, we can't tell, we can't be certain that it isn't being political, so we have to be political when we're organizing our educational infrastructure and curriculum. She continues, my criticism is directed merely at the pretense that scholarship necessarily is and ought to be politics, or that those whose loyalties are first of all to scholarship are ingenuous or reactionary or immoral or unaware of their own positioning and unwilling to give public account of that, because we hear that a lot. Is there no one left on the left still prepared to argue that scholarship is value in and of itself, and capable of recognizing that the impact it makes invariably escapes the control of the scholar, however self-critical and self-reflexive he or she may be? And a couple of my arguments against. So as I alluded to earlier, it brings in bias and dogma, which is bad for the epistemic aims of research, understanding, truth-seeking. If you're bringing in your biases and your preferences and your desires and your wants and your wishes, that is exactly the clouding that the scientific method is intending to mitigate for in the first place. Its whole point is to mitigate for the biases that we have. If we don't understand our environment, so if through bringing biases into our research, our description and our vision of what is going on is clouded, then we are unable to apply appropriate solutions. If you don't understand the environment that you're in, you can't act appropriately. And this is including complex social issues. It is often argued that social issues like inequities in society or dynamics between groups is so complex that it requires a completely different methodology to analyze it. While I agree in part that yes, we may need sort of a different kind of paradigm for thinking about that particular series of issues, I do reject the idea that it needs a completely different paradigm to give a description of what's going on so that we can act appropriately. It increases the likelihood of censorship as deviation from dogma becomes unacceptable, even in conversation, and this stifles academic creativity, so that kind of follows from the first one. If we settle that education and research is political, then all that we are left with is the eternal conflict to seize control over these domains to bring about our desired state of political affairs by overt or covert means. Because it just becomes a war. And to be honest, that is already how they see it. It's already political. We've heard them describe it's already political. You're already enforcing a series of values on everybody. You're already imposing your societal structure on everyone, and it's having a negative impact on X number of people. And I'm not saying those things aren't to be taken seriously, but we can't just be at war with one another, especially with education, because then we're just using people's children to fight an ideological war, which we probably shouldn't do. And four, the public can no longer trust the outputs of science and research. If what is true is arbitrary and not the result of a careful methodology which seeks to mitigate for bias rather than embrace it, then the knowledge that research produces is of no real use to anyone except those who wish to use it to justify their holding on to power, depriving the everyday man of the ability to question authority, a return to the rule by the wise and a follow the science kind of society. Look at the cheekbones on this guy. Trofim Lysenko and the Holodomor, 1898 to 1976. He was a Soviet scientist, agriculturalist, agronomist, who rejected Western bourgeois concepts of genetics, favoring a class-oriented approach to science, as was typical in the Soviet Union. Kirill Orozionov, 1994, showed in his paper, Stalin as Lysenko's editor, Reshaping Political Discourse in Soviet Science, that Stalin himself had made amendments to the outputs of the supposedly more objective Soviet science concerning agriculture. Bringing your bias in makes it more objective. It sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? This scientific output was used to justify agricultural practices which, among the attempts at collectivization, contributed to the 7 or 8 million Russians, including an estimated 3 million Ukrainians, dying from starvation, and what is known as the Holodomor. His practices were also later taken up by Mao in China, which led to significantly more deaths. Rozionov says, it is remarkable how much emphasis was laid in the years of Stalin's life on the political correctness of language used in scientific publication. But it is even more striking that Stalin himself tried to control the content of science, editing scientific transcripts. It is hard to imagine similar behavior on the part of the political leaders of the democratic countries, such as I know, right? I couldn't. Don't worry, we'll get there, don't worry. Or even other dictators such as Hitler or Mussolini. Even in George Orwell's famous classic 1984, the top political leaders who stood behind the mythical Big Brother didn't do it themselves. The work of rewriting history was done by small clerks in the Ministry of Truth. And the final lines of this paper, he says, Stalin, being an editor, only confirmed his rank as top political leader, and it became simply the next logical step for Stalin to move from editing texts on nature to editing nature itself. Sadiq Khan's deputy urged scientists to alter studies showing emissions scheme had no impact on child health. Emails reveal Shirley Rodriguez asked scientists to reword the study's conclusion that found no evidence of benefits to children's lungs. Now, this request was denied or refused, but the attempt alone is, in my opinion, a shocking indictment of where we find ourselves, how normal it has become to politicize research, and of the inflated egos of those who think they can ask researchers to alter their findings to match their political agenda. A fun one, the grievance studies affairs. James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian in 2017, 2018. I think they put 2 years aside to put together incredibly sophisticated parodies of critical literature and submit them to tier 1, very influential critical journals under fake names. 7 or 8 of these were published, and a couple of them were given awards. And they were nonsense. They were constructed nonsense. They'd studied the literature, they'd studied the rhetorical and manipulative devices that are deployed in critical theorizing, and they just parodied it and submitted it, and they were peer-reviewed. They went through the peer review process and were published as scientific output. And I'll give you the most popular example. They call it Dog Park, and they basically came up with this study where they spent thousands of hours in a year looking at dogs' genitalia in Dog Park and observing the rate at which men separated humping dogs, whether they separated dogs humping male dogs more than dogs humping female dogs, and what this tells about rape culture. If you haven't had a look at that, I suggest you go and have a look at it. Slightly less fun. Interim governance group to develop national anti-racist infrastructure in Scotland. provide independent oversight and hold Scottish Government accountable, work to establish a programme of systemic change on race equality, support the establishment of an independent observatory, and support the transition to a permanent governance body. It would then remain in place for at least a year until its remit is fulfilled and a permanent race equality governance body is established and functioning. The group will not be subject to freedom of information requests and will not be required to respond to freedom of information requests. Well, this sounds a little bit like Ibram X. Kendi's proposal to have an anti-racist amendment, to add an anti-racist amendment to the US Constitution. In Politico magazine in 2019, he said it would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. Formally trained experts on racism. I wonder what kind of experts they'll be, from what field. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield racial inequity, monitor these policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. This is the same Ibram X. Kendi who wrote in How to Be an Anti-Racist, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities, as an anti-racist. Recall back to the fusion of structure and agency. And perhaps most famously or infamously, depending on who you ask, he says the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Is that the anti-racism they're talking about? An independent body of government oversight not beholden to freedom of information requests predicated on a concept of anti-racism that may well include racism. Not good. In conclusion, research and education ought to be as minimally political as possible. In the case of research, this should especially be the case, as politically motivated knowledge used to justify public and social policy as well as governance structures could have non-trivial to disastrous consequences for millions of people, all while failing to solve the problems political activist researchers promise to solve and devaluing the enterprise of science. Before I finish, I want to close the circle on the concept of metaphysical pathos that we were introduced to at the beginning by reading from a short paragraph from the end of a paper called On Some Hegelisms by William James from 1882. He says, "My conclusion is that the togetherness of things in a common world may, when perceived, engender a very powerful emotion. That Hegel was so unusually susceptible to this emotion throughout his life that its gratification became his supreme end and made him tolerably unscrupulous as to the means he employed, that indifferentism is the true outcome of every view of the world which makes infinity and continuity to be its essence, and that pessimistic or optimistic attitudes pertain to the mere accidental subjectivity of the moment." Now, I introduced the concept of metaphysical pathos because I have a suspicion. You can tell me what you think about it. If it is the case that human beings have an emotional proclivity, sympathy, pathos to certain broad claims about the world, like all is one, which is fine, you're allowed to have that, right? That's not a problem. You're allowed to be a holist. It's not what I'm saying. But if it is the case that we do have a temperamental predisposition to some of these concepts, depending on the stage of our life that we're in or the things that have happened to us, and that in the post-Marxian world, that this desire, this drive, this sympathy to the concept of all is one has been provided with a practical means of orienting oneself towards it, and that the Hegel's dialectic has, as we've been through, an orientation towards totalism, right? That no satisfaction is to be found at any station along the way. Everything short of that is unsatisfactory. That this has been fused with practical politics. My question is, to what degree has this contributed over the last 150, 200 years to the bursts of totalitarianism that we have seen in various societies across the West and across the rest of the world, where millions and millions of people, seemingly normal people, fall into the trap or into a kind of trance and join in a pursuit to achieve the total? Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but thank you very much for listening.